Hey there, it's Ben Halsell here, and here in this tutorial we're going to have a look at Grid Pop from Stupid Raisins that is available from FxFactory. Now with this plugin, it allows you to lay out anything in a grid in Final Cut Pro 10. We're going to run through a few different examples, but let's dive right into it and have a look at how we work with Grid Pop in Final Cut Pro. So we're going to jump in here and have a look at setting up a couple of different grids for the Stupid Raisins Grid Pop. And the reason we're setting up a couple is with different types of images, or particularly different orientations of images, there's a couple of approaches that you'll need to take to actually set the grids up. And then we'll also have a look at how we can use something like the Cineflare Smooth transitions plugin to kind of give this nice whip transition that really adds a nice finishing touch when transitioning from one grid to another. So we're going to jump into a new timeline here, and we're going to have a look at how we can lay out all these images of a MacBook Pro into a grid as our kind of starting point. So I'm going to select all of these, so Command and A will select them all. We'll drag them down to timeline, and just to make sure they all have the same duration, I'm just going to do Control and D and type in 10 and then period, and that will give these all a kind of 10-second duration. It just means they match up when we eventually stack these up. So we have 14 images of the MacBook Pro here, and we won't use them all. We'll just use 12, so we have 3 rows of 4 images. Now the first thing to note is that all these images are the same size, so that makes the laying out of things a little bit easier, and we'll have a look at an example where all your images aren't the same orientation afterwards. But basically this means that when we kind of apply our columns and then eventually our rows, it makes life a little bit easier for us. So we're going to have 4 images in one row. And so basically, if you come across to your effects, if you've installed the Stupid Raisins Grid Pop, and remember these effects by FxFactory, you can always download the demo and try them out. So we're going to scroll up to our columns of 4. And basically, this is the way that you would kind of work with any of the grids that you're setting up, is to use the first, second, third, and fourth grid on kind of subsequent images. So I'm going to drag my 1 of 4 across to this image, and then we'll grab 2 of 4 and pull it across here. 3 of 4 to the third image, and 4 of 4 to the fourth image. So basically with these images you can see they've kind of changed a little bit in their location, but they're not in the right spot yet. So what we're going to do first of all is just kind of change the size of these images. So I'm going to highlight the first one, and we're going to type in a scale of 25%, and then we'll go to the second image. Now if I deselect my image, I can hover over here and I don't need to actually highlight it to change that, so I can just move my playhead along the timeline. And what we're going to do is we're going to set up this first column of images, so we've got them all in the right-ish spot here, and then we're going to copy and paste those attributes to other rows of our grid. So that's going to save us a bit of time when we're setting this up. So we're going to stack these up now, and we'll start to see our first line of our grid coming together a little bit. So there's a little bit of work here to do. So basically there's 2 things we can do here. One is to drop the size down a little bit more. So we'll drop down to 20%. And once we've dropped these down to 20%, we can kind of figure out a little bit of the offset. So basically I want to try and move these a little bit away from the center here, so that they're offset against one another. So I'm going to type into my X pixels for my first image, which if I tap the V key you can see is this image on the left. And I'm going to type in -10 for that. Okay, and then for the next image, this next image along, again I'm tapping the V key. I'm going to type in -5, and then for the next image we'll type in 5. Actually for this image we're going to type in -2.5, because for this image we're going to type in 2.5. Okay, and then for the last image in our row we'll type in 10. Now you can play around with these, and we don't need to figure out this precisely mathematically. We can kind of eyeball it a little bit as we go through, but you can see the minus and plus 2.5 there, create a distance of 5 between those, and I've already played around with this a little bit, and then the 10 will basically make this a similar sort of space on the outside, although it does look a little bit wider here. So let's make that -7.5 and 7.5 here. That looks pretty good. Now that we've got this kind of first row set up, I'm going to stack up these images and we'll snap them like this from the next few rows, and we'll try and pick some images that are a little bit different. So the images that we're placing next to each other are going to be on the same row, so I'm trying to kind of mix them up a little bit so that we don't have too much similarity. Although it doesn't matter too much for the example. Okay, we can delete those last two. So basically now we have the full size images here, and what we can do is select our first image that we've already kind of positioned, copy that, select the next two images, and I'm just holding down Shift to do that, and then doing Shift, Command, and V, and that will allow me to paste the attributes. So you can see I'm pasting the effect 1 of 4, along with all the changes we've made. So you'll see as we go from the top, copy that, select those two, holding Shift, Command and tap V to paste in, and you can see now we're moving that image across the right. And again, we'll do the same for the next line, and then Shift, Command and V to paste 3 of 4, select, oh, I missed a selection there, Shift, Command and V to paste 3 of 4, copy this one, select those two, Shift, Command and V, and paste 2 of 4, and so now we should have these lined up. In fact, I think I've added the effect twice on this one. You can see here, if I select this clip, and I can kind of find it by tapping the V key, I've pasted the 3 of 4 effect on there twice, which is why it got so super small. So we can just double check these. These all look pretty good. And now what we're going to do is wrap these up into compound clips. So if I select each of these, I'm going to hold down the Alt Option key and tap G, which is going to allow me to create a compound clip. So I might call this row 1. And then we'll do Alt, Option and G, row 2, Alt or Option and G, row 3, and then we have our 3 rows. So we can do row 1, row 2 and row 3 all stacked up. And now we'll select row 1. We'll come across to our effects here, and we're going to select the horizontal effect. So now we can select all of these rows. I'm holding down Command or Shift to select them all, and we can scroll up to the horizontal option here. If we double click, it would apply that effect to all of them. So I'll have row 1 at the bottom, so that's going to be my bottom 3 of 3 row. Just place the playhead there. Row 2 will be in the middle, so it's going to be my row 2 of 3, although I don't need to change it. And then my top row will be row 1 of 3 up there. So now you can see, using that combination of columns and rows, I get this real nice, super neatly spaced out grid. So now obviously with the grid pop, if we scroll down, you can see we've got options for a number of different column numbers. And then also if we come up to our horizontal options, with one of our clips selected, you can see again we've got up to 10 different rows that we can have there. So we've got a lot of flexibility with the grid pop. So I'm going to leave this here for the moment, and we'll move on to a different example. So we'll stay in the same timeline. I'm going to come to my event here, and we'll come into the green folder. And basically in here we have a number of different images that are all slightly different orientations. So I'm going to do Command and A to select all of these. We'll drop them down to the timeline. Then I'm going to do Control and D and type in 10 period to make them all 10 seconds long. And you may want to zoom to fit your timeline. So Shift and Z will do that if you don't see your entire timeline. So now basically what I want to do is actually get these images so that they're all filling the screen. So there's a couple of different steps here. So the first step is we're going to come to our crop options here. And we're going to select crop, and basically what we can do now is just reframe the crop for each of these images. So I'm just going to click in the gray area here. So now as I move through each of these clips, I can select crop, and it will allow me to kind of reframe them. And this is an important step for these, otherwise we're going to end up with a different kind of mishmash of clips here. So we're going to crop everything so that it's got that 16:9 format, and then we're going to turn them into compound clips. And this one we're going to delete. So when I click crop, I can kind of reframe things, or I can leave them as is, but we do need to run this crop and then also kind of group them all together. Okay, so we've got 17 clips along the timeline here, so I'm just going to pick out one and we'll delete it. So we'll delete this one. So with these 16 clips, we have a few different options. We could either do 2 rows of 8 or 4 rows of 4. So we've got a few different options in terms of the way we can lay it out. I think we're going to do 3 rows of 6 just to kind of see how well that works. So basically, before we do that, I'm just going to press done up here. So basically we've set these all up now so they all fill that frame. But before we can actually add the grid pop, we need to make these into a compound clip. And this is really quick to do. So I'm just going to make sure I've got everything deselected and bring my playhead over the first clip. And I'm going to do Alt and G. And this is basically going to group my clips together. And it's going to put them into the event timelines. But actually, let's just cancel out of this. I'm going to make a new event up here. We'll call this grid 2. So when I do Alt G here, I'm just going to number my items here. So we're going to have 1. We're going to put this in the new event that we made, grid 2. And to make a new event, we just do Alt and N, or Option and N. So now we can move through these, make sure we don't have anything selected. Alt and G. Type in the number. We'll put it in grid 2. Deselect. Alt G. So we'll just move through all these and make them into compound clips, and then we'll come back once this is done and get our grids set up. So we've made all these into compound clips now, and now we'll go ahead, once we've done this last one, popped it into grid 2, and we will start to set these out. And actually for this grid, we're going to have 3 rows of 5, so we're going to scroll down here. So we're going to lose one of these clips at some point, and we've got these 5 columns that we're going to set up, so we can start to add these to our first 5 clips. So now if we hover over these, you can see they've adjusted in terms of their location, and we can now adjust the scale. So we're going to start with 15%. Let's go for 20, and we'll just change each of these to 20. And remember, the first row is always going to be the one that takes the longest to set up, and then we can copy and paste these attributes as we go through. Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 3, and I'm just going to use Shift, Command, and the minus key just to make my timeline height a little smaller. 4 and 5. If we place the playhead there, you can see they're all nicely laid out. So we can come to number 1, and we're just going to eyeball this one a little bit. We'll move it across to the left. We'll come across to the right-hand clip and move it across to the right. And then we'll move these middle ones out a little bit as well. So we'll find the kind of rough positioning for these. I think we need to drop the percentage of these down a little bit more. So we'll go for 18% for the size of our clips. So now we can move this. We've got a little bit more space to move. And if you're moving one of these numbers up here in your inspector, if you hold down the Alt key, it will move it a little slower. So you can find you get a little bit more refined control over how you're moving it. So I think I had 10.6 or somewhere thereabouts. Again, holding down the Alt key, so I get that kind of slower movement. And we'll come back here. So our central one is going to stay in the same spot. So really the gap between these two should be the same. And so that was minus 5.3. So we'll go for plus 5.3 here. Again, holding down Alt. And that looks pretty good. So we've got the first row of our grid all set up. So let's get our next row set up. So we'll just stack these up, and then we'll do the same option of copying and pasting the attributes. And then we'll delete this last image here. So we'll select number 1 here, copy it, and then we'll select these. So holding down Shift and then Shift, Command, and V, and we'll paste that in there. And actually, again, we'll start from the top so we can see it happening. So we'll copy this, Shift, Command, V, paste that in there, copy this one, Shift, Command, V. Okay, so now these are all lined up nicely. So now we're going to select our rows, Alt and G, and then we'll call this row 1. And then row 2. And then row 3. So again, with these, we can now stack these up. we'll have row 1 at the bottom, so we'll actually highlight all of these, double click, and now we can select these individually, and this is our top one, so this is going to be 1 of 3, 2 of 3, and 3 of 3. So you can see we get that real nice kind of grid layout, and obviously we've got a bit of extra space between these two, so we can use that offset. So basically, if we come to our Y offset, we can lift those all back up a little bit, make a note of that number, and then come to the top one, and we'll drag this one down by the same amount. So I raised this bottom one by 4 and lowered this one by -4, and you can see now we've got that grid layout nice and perfect. So you can see here we can really easily lay these things out with a little bit of thought and planning using the Grid Pop plugin. Now, we have been using just images up to this point, but let's have a look at some videos. So we're going to grab some of these surf films, just grab a few clips down to the timeline. And I'm looking for the shortest one here, so that's this clip, which is 7 seconds long. So I'm going to highlight all of these and do Control D, and we'll make these all 7 seconds long by typing in 7 period there. So now they're all the same length. So this is going to be a grid of 4, so essentially we're going to have 2 columns here. So we'll select this first one, and we can drag on number 1, and then number 2, and then these ones we'll leave until we have these set up, and at which point we can copy and paste the attributes. So for this first one, we will drop this to 50%, and I'm going to grab this next one, and we'll come to our video options here, and then we'll change this to 50% as well. Okay, so you can see we've got these 2 clips side by side. Let's just stack them up. It's going to make this a little bit easier. Oh, it looks like I typed in 48% there by accident, so we're going to type in 50. And so now we have these both exactly the same size. So with these set up like this, you can see even though they're 50%, they're not moving right to the edge. So I can drag this to the right until we touch that edge. So let's type in 15 there, and we'll type in -15 here. Okay. There's still a little bit of a line here. So actually, just to kind of keep these a bit more easily kind of lined up, we're going to type in 45 here. So they're going to have a bit of a border around them, and then that should be good. So basically we've got these 2 clips side by side, nice and easily set up, and then we'll do the same for these 2 clips. So I'm going to select this first clip, copy it, paste those attributes, and then copy this and paste those attributes. So now we've got these 2 sets of clips kind of lined up perfectly, and what we want to do is add the row options here. So because we've only got 4 clips, I'm not going to nest those sequences. I'm just going to highlight them both and add the horizontal options there, and we'll put this as 1 of 2. We need to highlight these individually. Okay, and then we'll do the same for these ones. Double click on the horizontal option, and then we've got 2 of 2 and 2 of 2. So now with these clips one at a time, we can stack them up there, and you'll see we have that 4-up grid. So now with these, we do need to kind of modify the location of them. So we'll just do that manually here. So we can modify the X distance here. So we'll send this up by 7.5 and see where we land. Do the same for this one. And again, holding down the Alt key when I get close to that 7.5. And then we'll try -7.5 here. And I really am guessing these numbers. Sort of educated guess, I guess. But -7.5 looks like it's working pretty well. And again, you can see we've got a kind of bigger gap in the middle here, so we can play with this a little bit. So basically, I can come up to the top here and slide these in. Let's try -12 and 12. And that's looking pretty good. So basically we've got a nice kind of grid there of these 4 clips. They're playing through well. And we could play around with the numbers and kind of get it right. And one of the nice things that will happen if we do that is that if we take 4 more clips, let's just arrange them differently. Okay, so same clips, but just in a slightly different location. If I come to the end of my clips here, I can do Alt and the right square bracket, trim them all down to the same length, and then just zoom in a little bit here. I can copy and paste the attributes from this to the next clip. So if I copy that, Shift Command V, I can paste all those attributes and it's going to put them in exactly the right spot or in the matching spot. So if you've got multiple clips and you want to make a more elaborate split screen with these kind of column layouts, then you can do that here really easily. So Command C, select the next clip or more than one clip, and Shift Command V, paste those attributes, and then you will have kind of matching locations here. So you can see even though these are the same videos, we're getting a kind of nice matching of the location. So let's move to another option we've got here. So we've got these grids kind of laid up together. Now there's a couple of things we can do here. If we select all of these, I'm going to do Alt and G. So we'll call this grid laptop. And then I'm going to select my second one. We'll do Alt and G. We'll call this grid images. And then for my last 2 surfing ones, we'll do Alt and G, and we'll call this surf 1. And we'll call this one surf 2. So now with these 4 grids, we want to find a way that they're actually going to kind of maybe a bit more animated on screen, where we can get a bit of movement in there. And one thing you can do here is use something like the Ken Burns effect. We'll just deselect everything. And if we use the Ken Burns here, you can see we can start and finish at different points in the clip. Now, the resolution of these, I think you need to be mindful of it. When we zoom right in on these nests, it doesn't keep its original resolution here from what I've seen. So basically, we're only doing a small movement here. So basically, we've got a little bit of kind of movement there, which is going to be nice. We'll do the same here. Okay, and then we'll do the same for the surf ones as well. And we'll just flip this one so they're kind of bouncing back and forth. So we've got a zoom out, a zoom in, a zoom out again, and a zoom in. So just those alternating Ken Burns effects, and you can see now we get that little bit of movement there. So we can obviously trim these down as well. So let's just trim these down in length a little bit. And with these, it's always useful to have a little bit extra so that you can trim them down later. So that's why the 10 seconds is nice. But once we've got them ready, then we can trim them down. Means the Ken Burns is a bit more accentuated. And then we need to find a way of kind of moving between these different clips. So that's where this next plugin comes in. So we're going to jump to our titles here, and we're going to come to the Cineflare Smooth titles. So another plugin from FxFactory, but this works really nicely with this particular example. So we're going to zoom in here, and we'll just start. We'll actually scroll down here, and we'll go for one of these long travels. So we'll begin here and end here, and then we'll do the same for the next one and end. And then for the last one, we'll try one of these rotations. So we'll hit Shift and Z to zoom out. So we've got a transition for each one. So let's give this a playthrough. Okay, so we've got some nice transitions there, and one last thing we can add is add a motion blur on here. And I've done some tests with this, and I've found that if I add the motion blur when we've kind of got all these nested layers, compound clips, and the transitions all set up here, it takes an incredibly long time to render it all. So there's a workaround for this. And what I'm going to do here is disable all of my Cineflare Smooth transitions. So I'm just going to tap the V key with those all deselected. I'm going to mark an in point, come to the end here and mark an out point, and then we're going to export this out. So because of all the compound clips in here, you basically end up with a render jam that never seems to really work itself out very quickly. So we're going to export out video and audio video here with Apple ProRes, and we'll hit next. And then once we've got that set up, we're going to export this out as export no motion blur. We'll save that out. And because we're exporting out in ProRes 422, which is the same codec as the timeline is rendered in, it should export out really quickly. So once this is exported out, we have our video just without any of the transitions. So it's just going to be a kind of straight cut from one of these clips to the next. And then we're going to add in our Cineflare Smooth transitions, which really kind of makes these transition nicely between one clip and the next. So I'm going to right click up here and we'll come to our clip and we'll close this up. And then we'll drop this right onto the timeline, and we're dropping it below those transitions that are there already. So you can see it just dropping in exactly the right spot on the timeline. We'll turn these back on by tapping the V key once they're selected. And then we'll come back into our Cineflare Smooth, and we're going to grab Motion Blur 4 here. And actually what I'm going to do is we'll zoom in here. And what I'm going to do is mark an in point at the beginning of the transition and an out point at the end of the transition. And then when I double click on my motion blur, it's basically going to add it in that spot there. So we can do this for the next ones as well. So if I come to my next transition, mark an in point, mark an out point, double click here, it's going to add that in there. And the last one. So now with just the video layer underneath there, obviously our compound clips are still underneath there, but they're not going to affect the rendering here because they're on a layer below. We'll get a much quicker render out of the motion blur there. And this is a trick you can use if you're having any problems kind of layering up motion blur and stuff like that with other transitions or effects, is to render out your kind of base video and then add the motion blur on after that. So you can see that the rendering happens much more quickly here. We'll come back to the beginning and we'll really see that nice difference having the motion blur on here. So if we play this through, so as you can see, the motion blur just kind of really makes that transition from one clip to the next work really well. So hopefully you found this tutorial useful, using the Stupid Raisins grid pop, and then thinking about using the Cineflare Smooth transitions as well to kind of really make those transitions happen nicely. Using either video or stills, I find it works really well. So if you have any questions about the techniques used in this particular tutorial, then please leave a comment below. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you on the next tutorial.